Speaking of reliability, a podcast with good friends talking with you about reliability engineering topics. Welcome to Speaking of Reliability. This is Fred Schenkelberg.
And this is Carl Carlson.
Well, hey, Carl, it's officially end of fire season out here in California. It's raining. Some would say back in the Midwest, cats and dogs. Although when I was a little kid, I ran outside looking for the kitten. My mom was laughing.
You have a
so
fire
hard.
season and a rainy season.
That's it, and we're there now. But that just means it's going to snow all over Thanksgiving weekend for everybody else.
Right.
But anyway, hey, we got a voice message on our SpeakPipe doohickey from Tom. And I thought that since you and I have talked about this topic so many times, I thought Tom brought a different perspective to this. So we need to talk some more about it. Let's listen to what he had to say. And then we'll probably have to think about how we're going to answer it. So here we go.
Hi, Fred. My name's Tom, and I'm a huge fan of the podcast, and thank you for all that you share through Accendo. Earlier this year, I passed the CRE exam, and now I'm trying to build a reliability program and team in my current company. But how do I do that is what I've been pondering, and I think that's a question, I'd like to ask you or pose as a potential topic for the podcast. Where do you start to build a reliability team? And I've heard you and Chris talk about where do you start with reliability in general, given any one tool, and you were suggesting to do a good FMEA or FMECA or fault tree analysis to help, assess the design in terms of particular failure modes or mechanisms. But some hypotheticals that I've been asked, if I am given one additional member to the team or 5 additional members to the team, what is the team doing and how is it supporting the design to be, reliable and robust? My current company, we do FMEA decently. We don't do much of fault tree, and for the most part, by and large, it's pretty test heavy, reactive reliability, trying to do some sort of accelerated life test through, time compression, cycle testing, and to find failure modes. But, my question would be, where does one start to build a reliability team, and how do you get going?
All right. So, and I know I sent you a copy of this, Carl, a couple of weeks ago. And I think your first thought was, oh, this is more than one episode.
It was like, well, I love that. I love the message from Tom. And it just hits right at the core of what of the real world. And I thought that'd be fun to talk about, building a reliability program.
Yep. And it sounds like, in the follow-up, I sent him a message right away saying, oh, you need to buy our book. So he sent a photo of the book on his desk. It's like, okay, sorry. And the little bit of extra that we got via email was that their current reliability program, per se, is a pretty solid testing program. They do lots of testing. And yet they're missing things in the design part. And it, without getting into too much of the specifics of it, is in selecting a component, for example, they select on functionality, on price, on availability, typical stuff that we do when procuring a component or a subsystem anytime. Are they a viable business? Can they meet our demand? Are they, quality control? Those kinds of things. Yet what is inherently missing is it reliable? And so they find out too late in testing, and then this component is wired into it and causes a lot of havoc. So it sounds like he's got some management support to what do we need to do different in the design phase to get this right. And so the program isn't from scratch. It's not a startup, it's an established company. They've grown doing lots of testing and decent failure analysis, yet their design for reliability aspect seems to be a weak link. Now, there's a whole lot more information needed to really, create a plan. And I think if that's all right with you, Carl, maybe we should start with that. Is what is it that he needs to do now in order to lay the groundwork to be able to implement a plan. And then maybe we'll come back in another episode and talk about how do you implement it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And boy, so many things are coming to mind here. One of the things that comes to mind on listening to what Tom was talking about and reading the email is the importance of the gap assessment. And one of the, you have these 6 steps that we talk about in the steps to achieving high reliability.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is gap assessment, but that's one of the most important ones because in his case, there's a strength, and we talk about this in our book, the importance of recognizing not just the gap, but also the strengths.
Yep.
They have a strength of a really good testing program, and they have a known gap of the design for reliability. But that's not the end of the gap assessment.
No.
Because the whole point of understanding the gaps is what are your resources? Where are you on the maturity matrix, for example?
Yep.
And of course, we don't know that about Tom's organization. And all of that is so important. So the length and breadth of the gap assessment, to me, would accomplish a lot in building Tom's reliability program. So that's the first thought I had.
Well, I back up a little bit more. Given that it seems like he's getting a mandate from his management team, is right now harness that. It's the first discussion is, well, what is it? I mean, finding a poor decision in testing about selecting a component, that's a project in and of itself. But if you want to do it generalized, so it affects not just the selection of components, but the design of systems and how do we set up functions and rule, all of the early stuff in the design concept and early design flush out, basically that whole phase, that's a big project. And that's going to take serious management support to make it work. And so I'd go back to that very first chapter or first step is, what are we trying to achieve? Is it saving time to market or saving cost in development or improving our product's reliability in the field? Where do we want to stand next to our competitors? What is the vision here? And from that gives us the ability to do the gap assessment.
Well, I'm definitely going to agree with you on that.
You wrote that part. So.
Yeah. And the reason I'm bringing up the gap assessment isn't that we don't do the strategic vision. That's essential. Really, all the steps are essential.
Right.
I'm just amazed at sometimes how deep the gaps can go and breadth. But you're correct. We have to start with the vision. Let me share a story with you. And you might have heard this. I can't remember if I brought this one up during some of our tutorials at Rams. Back in my early years at General Motors, I was concerned about supplier parts. I was concerned about the systems, obviously,
right,
but nothing in place to assess the reliability of supplier parts. So we'd work really hard on what GM designed and built, and then sort of take whatever the suppliers had. And yes, we could test them, but Tom's story about the springs that didn't meet the 300,000 cycles, that type of thing.
Right.
That just reminded me of the whole subject of who has responsibility for supplier reliability. So I asked that question of my executive director, and he looked at me and goes, "You know what? I don't know." We knew who had responsibility for supplier quality.
Right.
Whole division, the whole department on supplier quality.
Right. And they were focused on SPC and consistency and did they fill out the paperwork correctly?
Yeah.
And stuff like that.
Materials, did they, exactly. Are the incoming parts meet quality?
Is it the right dimensions? The kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So his name was the executive director. I'm trying to remember now. It'll come to me, Rick. Rick looks at me and goes, "I don't know who that is. Come with me." So we walked down back then they actually had a mahogany row at GM. And we're going down the mahogany panels and some places I've never been, knocking on doors, open up the door and say, do you have responsibility for supplier quality? We just went up and down the executive rows. And nobody back then, this is back in the 80s, nobody said, yep, I'm the one that has responsibility for supplier reliability.
Yeah, no, they're all smart enough not to take on another task.
Yeah. and so it looked like nobody had the responsibility. So then I thought to myself, let's walk into the VP of purchasing.
Mm-hmm.
And they go, well, yeah, we have responsibility to purchase the parts, but no one's really talked to us about purchasing reliable parts.
We don't know what that is.
We have to purchase parts based on certain costs and different things.
Yeah, availability, political influences.
Yeah.
There's so much that goes into setting up a vendor relationship.
So thus began a journey for me personally at GM, where I would work with the purchasing department to set up. And they said, well, of course, you have to have requirements. So that's good. Okay. So we got the requirements for the supplied parts, made sure they were the correct requirements, had all the right elements in them, not just a number, but et cetera. So we've talked about that. And then get them into the technical specifications so that when they go out to bid for the supplier parts, there are actually specifications for those parts. And then the bids started coming in, and I started sitting in on the supplier purchasing meetings. And sure enough, they wanted to get the low cost and what have you. But I said, wait a minute, what about reliability? And the supplier would look at us and here's the specification. It just was a journey to get that in place. And that's what I wanted to state, is that it isn't a matter of what is the testing spec. Yes, of course, that's important. And the reliability requirement. It's a matter of, if you're going to purchase the parts, getting them, basically buying parts that meet the reliability requirements.
Yeah. And that's what, the example Tom sent us in the email is they had a spring in whatever system. I don't even know what system they're creating. They had a spring, and it internally they knew it had to operate, because of its use, 300,000 cycles. So they put it on test, and it failed in 20,000 cycles. And they went to the vendor, and the vendor said, well, you didn't ask us for a 300,000 one. We don't make one of those. Yeah, the way you're using it, it'll fail pretty quick. We could have told you that if you asked, kind of thing.
Right.
I'm filling in some blanks there. And I was like,
so now if Tom's company is designing the springs, well, then that body of knowledge, that expertise would know what about the springs create reliability. There's going to be a certain dimension in terms of diameter of the spring. There's going to be, there's materials, there's basically characteristics that make the spring work and make it reliable. And you would understand, if you're designing the spring, what the failure mechanisms are. And there you get into the FMEAs, that kind of thing, which is different than when you're buying the spring.
Yeah. And you're counting on them to know it. What I find most of the time and the procurement part of this is just one piece of it, is one of these gaps that shows up, is we don't ask. And oftentimes the procurement team or whoever is first making contact with the suppliers doesn't know to ask, well, how will it fail in our use, the way we're planning on using it? Not how reliable it is, because you're going to get a sales guy, oh, it'll never fail, it'll last 80,000 hours, it'll be forever, don't worry about it. You'll get nonsense answers a lot of times. So I always advise people to ask, how will it fail the way we expect to use it? So you got to share a little bit of information, especially for elements that are critical to the functionality of your system. How will it fail in our application? We expect to use it 300,000 times, cycles. One, can it? And two, how will it fail? And that single rephrasing, not how reliable is it? What does your testing tell you about it? Because the suppliers oftentimes, and I've had more than one supplier I've worked with that said, for example, we make inductors. They go in everything. Some are in satellites, some are in submarines, some are, in automobiles, some are in radios on your desk. I don't know. Do people really still have radios on their desk? Anyway, he said, we don't know, exactly how when somebody buys 1,000 of these things, we don't know what they're doing with it. We really don't. It's not part of the purchase process for us. It's a discrete component. It's a commodity-ish thing. We just don't know. And they kind of are blind to it. But every now and then they said, a customer comes in and says, hey, we want to put this in a satellite. Will it work? And they come in and say, here's the kind of radiation exposure it'll have. Here's kind of the thermal cycling it's going to get. Here's the environment. And they said, we have a couple of engineers that love that stuff, because then they learn, one, how customers use it, and ask questions that we just won't typically get a chance to go do, because we just don't know. And so it's not an imposition on the supplier to say, will it work over time? And how will it fail? It may be something they've just never have thought of for your particular application. The issue is that that's just one of the many gaps. The issue that Tom's talking about is, well, how do I build a program here? Because, and I think we've talked about it before, is how do you work with suppliers and how do you work with your procurement teams? And there's a bunch of training and awareness and things like that that go into it. But that's just one gap if you're going to create a design for reliability program. Because what I've read, reading between the lines, is all of the product life cycle process that's in place in that organization is saying functionality, costs, can we, all of the typical things about making procurement work or making a product work. What was missing in that discussion was, will it last over time? And part of that was because they have, in my reading between the tea leaves here, is that they have a strong reliability testing program. They go test stuff. And that is where the gap caught them. It's because two things can happen. Is one, it's too little too late. They find out, well, it doesn't work, but now it's integral designed into the system. We got to redesign the whole thing. Or it's, well, we didn't catch it. We didn't test for that failure mode because we didn't know it existed. So it's kind of it's too late. It's reactive in nature. So
we really have two things, Fred, with Tom and his question. One is this, that was an example. He said, okay, here's an example of what we're running into. And then from that example, but backing away from that, I think the guidance of getting a good reliability plan in place is good guidance. And that plan takes the vision, like you talked about, where it's not just a theoretical vision, is what is their specific vision, their company for this project. In other words, you can do a vision for one project, you could do a vision for a program. So you have to set the scope, and that's important. And so we would want Tom to work with his management to define that vision for that particular product line or for a project. And once that's done, and then a thorough gap assessment, which identifies the strengths and the gaps. And one of the gaps is clearly DFR, but you could build on, there's going to be possibly some other gaps. I mean, you have
it's also, to be much more specific, it's the gap assessment says, it's not part of the prioritization, or we're focusing on time instead of these other parts. We don't get quick prototypes so we can do mock-ups and early testing of these things early on, or evaluate them early on. The procurement piece we talked about already, but there's probably some forces at play in the current process. But it's, instead of saying we need better DFR, which is kind of throwing a solution at a wall and hope it sticks, is what are the specific things that are blocking that from happening? And then what are the specific things that, because designers inherently want to create a product that works. What are they doing well? And what can you build on? And so it's get enough detail, and it doesn't take terribly long time. It's a day or two of interviews with a couple, the key folks, maybe 8 to 10 interviews as a core of it. And then it's a lot of, we talk about it in the book, it's an ongoing process, always listening, paying attention to what's going on. But how do they make their decisions, and what are the forces driving that? And that can identify where you can make a difference. And I think that then leads to the plan, is where, and we talk about how to prioritize all the various many decisions that need to be made. Yet I've always found the assessment process, or that gap analysis process, is so illuminating. And I know I've told you before, Carl, and on the show, is that I sent the report to a project manager, and she said, or a director of engineering or something like that in this company. And we sat down to go over it, and she said, "You were only here for one day. How do you know so much about our organization?" I listened, kind of.
In part of this in coaching Tom and other people is to trust the process. Don't try to envision where it's going to end up exactly. Make sure you have a good vision. Make sure you know the gaps. Trust the process, because then when you identify the decisions that need to be made, which is another step after the gaps, that is part of the process, and that's going to get you involved with where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. On the with the management. And so all of this is do the steps of these achieving high reliability process steps, the process to achieve reliability engineering. And that will get you to where you need to go. And I think some people may want to shortcut it and say, well, I know what needs to be done. We just need to do this.
Well, the process itself gives us a really solid foundation of information that allows us to make a coherent plan that has a pretty decent chance of really making a difference. The other piece it does is, because it involves so many other people, is it sets the buy-in and acceptance that this plan is well thought out, and everybody involved, all the major stakeholders have contributed to it or have been, participants in it. Is a plan in and of itself is just a piece of paper. A plan that has a whole team behind it now is actionable. And I think part of that process is creating the goodwill and the buy-in and acceptance that we're going to try something different here and make a difference, because we're trying to achieve this goal or this objective that we all agree on. I just jumping ahead and saying, I know what to do. We need to train procurement and go get a training package together, is kind of really missing the boat. If you hadn't talked to procurement before, they like, what are you calling this to this class for? What's this about? You're 2 steps behind at that point.
So this is a good point to segue to part 2. In other words, let's do this in a two-part podcast, because we basically got part of Tom's question answered.
Now
not all of it.
Now we have to do the teaser. What is our next episode going to be about?
Exactly. What are we going to do next?
Yeah, if you're listening to this, and you're like, well, how would you approach this? What would you do? This is, they obviously had this example with procurement, but have you seen a situation like this? Did you just slap a plan together, do some training, and it worked, or not? And what do you think is the next step, and the hard part about the next step? And I think we'll leave it like that. And Tom sent us a voice message through SpeakPipe, which is at accendoreliability.com/go/SOR. Just push the button, and you can, if you have a microphone, then you can talk to us, which is cool. So go ahead and do that. And if you'd rather write your question to us, Carl and I and the other hosts of the show are available through LinkedIn and our About pages, or you could just email us. Our email addresses are also, most of us anyway, have it on our About pages. So plenty of ways for you to get in touch. We'll try to get an answer to you right away. And more than likely, we'll probably talk about it on the show. And we'll see how it goes. But now I'm itching to see where you think the next step is, Carl, because
I'm looking forward to it.
I think we don't agree on it, but I just suspect
that. We'll let it unfold.
All right, there you go. Thanks, Carl. We'll talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening to Speaking of Reliability. We invite you to join the conversation. If you have a question or a topic that you think we should discuss in a future show, please let us know. You can find a comment box below the episode show notes, or just leave a note as part of a review on iTunes.